of such magnificent and magical changes in the way we live our lives and in our understanding of the universe. Amazing inventions, sweeping social changes, and courageous explorations. Which are the most positive, the most important, the most inspiring? Which accomplishments will mark our century for all the years to come? We asked 16 prominent historians to vote on their top 100 choices. Tonight, the results, as we count down the greatest achievements of the 20th century. Number 100. Until the second half of the century, most of the planet remained unexplored, beyond our reach, below the surface of the oceans. It wasn't until the invention of scuba and pressurized submersibles that the mysterious and beautiful undersea world became a place that humans could inhabit. And when we did, it changed forever our understanding of Earth's geology and of life itself. 99. It's always been too easy to dismiss people with physical, sensory, or mental disabilities as less than the rest of us. But in the beginning of the century, Helen Keller made us face the fact that though she could neither see nor hear, her gifts were greater than most of ours. Today, laws guarantee people with disabilities the same access to the world as every other person, and help ensure that we can all enjoy the contributions they have to make. 98. After more than 30 years of conflict, Egypt became the first Arab nation to sign a peace agreement with Israel in March of 1979. The world breathed a small sigh of relief at this first step toward a peaceful resolution of Middle East hostilities. 97. Rocketry had its beginnings in China more than 700 years ago. The problem was, with gunpowder for fuel, skyrockets couldn't be aimed with any precision. At the start of the 20th century, a physics professor, Robert Goddard, suggested a solution in a rather dry paper with a Big Bang finish. He concluded that with a rocket powered by liquid fuel, it would be possible to steer so precisely that you really could travel to the moon.
People made fun of him when Goddard became rather retiring because, he was the guy who was going to make people go to the moon. Ha ha, what a joke.
Goddard spent nearly 20 years trying to design a successful liquid fuel rocket, driving prototypes out to his Aunt Effie's farm in Massachusetts for testing, only to have them fail.
Goddard was a solitary. He was doing something very weird and crankish that had no real application that anybody could think of.
On March 16, 1926, he finally succeeded in getting his 10-foot-long Nell off the ground. Soon he had liquid fuel rockets blasting as high as 9,000 feet into the sky. One of rocketry's greatest pioneers, Goddard went on to file hundreds of patents for everything from gyroscopic guidance systems to multi-stage rockets.
Some of the things that Goddard did were then later on taken up by the German group, which then developed the V2, which is the true ancestor of all contemporary rockets.
When Apollo 11 was on its way to the moon in a liquid-fueled rocket, the New York Times paid tribute to Goddard by finally admitting the Times had been in error 49 years earlier when they said his idea of space travel was impossible.
Every small 6 solids reported going very smoothly, everything going very nice.
96. The highest place on Earth, called the Goddess Mother of the World by the people of Tibet and Nepal. Mount Everest had always been considered off-limits to mortals. No one had even tried to climb it before Tibet began allowing foreigners in 1920.
Once the North Pole and the South Pole had been gotten to, people recognized that there was really only one great geographical achievement that was left.
10 times it was attempted and 10 times the expeditions failed, claiming the lives of some of the greatest mountaineers in the world.
You could go down to the bottom of the oceans, you could go to the moon, but these were to a large extent technological achievements. Human beings, brave though they were sort of along in the box for the ride. But to go up to the top of Everest was something that could only be done by individual human beings.
In a 1853 expedition led by British explorer John Hunt, New Zealand beekeeper Edmund Hillary and Nepalese Sherpa Tenzing Norgay prepared to make the ascent to the barren and forbidding summit.
Everest is so high that it's almost impossible to imagine a human being getting up there. It has no air, it's steep, it's snow, it's just incredibly difficult. The normal person, if you put them up on Everest, the first thing they would notice is the drop. It's not like looking down from the top of a building, it's like looking down from an airplane. But to a climber like Edmund Hillary, that would have been normal. He was used to that. The difficult thing for him would just be putting one foot in front of the other. It's so high. The longer you spend up there, the closer you are to dying. Even with oxygen breathing equipment, you just can't live indefinitely up there.
At 11:30 a.m. on May 29, 1953, Hillary and Norgay reached the top, more than 29,000 feet above the surface of the seas.
At the start of the 20th century, if people talked about human courage and endurance and achievement, they probably first thought of some soldier, some military terms. And one of the things that I think the conquest of Everest symbolizes is a kind of human courage and achievement that does not take place in a fight or against other human beings, but that takes place against none but ourselves.
What would we do without them? With innovations in storage capacity and length of life, batteries can now give us enough power to make anything electronic completely portable. 94.
You're one of the most beautiful girls I've ever seen.
I think my mouth is too big.
No, it's the right size.
Some say the sexual revolution began in 1948. When biologist Alfred Kinsey published the results of the first large-scale survey of human sexual behavior.
And of course it was a bombshell. He's saying people are thinking about sex and doing it and doing more weird versions of it than anyone has ever admitted.
Thanks to authors like Kinsey, sexual behavior, it's something that we communicate about. It's no longer a hidden area.
93.
And here it is, Alan Freed's Rock and Roll Party.
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline.
I remember falling in love with Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Elvis Presley, and my parents saying this is just the merest of fads and, it will be gone in no time. It is music for the masses. Anybody can sing it. They may not sound like Elvis Presley or Chuck Berry, but they can sing it. And it's a great dance music. Rock and roll was also associated with rebellion. This was Eisenhower's America. And here comes rock and roll, which is basically, a kind of swear word in the face of conformist culture. And looking at Elvis Presley, he just played those two sides of the 50s perfectly. He got up there, he swiveled his hips, he hung his lip, he lowered his head and smoldered. And yet in his interviews, it's all about, my mama says there's nothing wrong with anything I'm doing. He's an aw shucks, nice mama's boy. It's hard to imagine the music scene, rock and roll, getting as big as it did without Elvis.
92. Social Security, National Health Services, unemployment insurance, environmental and consumer protection.
In that purpose, government played an indispensable role.
The world became a kinder, gentler place in the 20th century, in part because governments began to accept responsibility for helping and protecting their citizens. 91.
In the 20th century, as most people became more sedentary, sports got bigger. the athlete becomes, in a sense, that part of us that exists that will never be seen, that physical performer who can, of course, hit the home run and make the touchdown. There's always been that dream that this is really us. Sports heroes become huge figures in the popular culture. Babe Ruth is probably the signal figure here. Babe Ruth, who was once asked in the 30s why he was making more than President Hoover, this is during the Depression, he said, I had a better year.
90. On June 23, 1948, the 2.5 million citizens of West Berlin were cut off from the outside world by a Soviet blockade. The plan was to starve the isolated territory into joining communist East Germany that completely surrounded it. But for nearly 11 months, despite all obstacles, the British and Americans managed to mount a massive relief airlift. More than 800 flights a day brought in all the supplies needed to keep a whole city alive and free. 89. When most people worked long hours on the farm without the help of machines, physical fitness just wasn't an issue.
As technology took over, most of us sit before television screens or sit at offices. In the fast food, the fitness movement could only take place in a society that was literally going to pot.
With waistlines beginning to sag and heart diseases sharply on the rise, along came Dr. Kenneth Cooper. By alerting us to the importance of regular aerobic exercise for health, he got us moving again.
For one's creative purposes in life and for one's longevity, mind and body cannot be separated out.
88. At the time, steel magnate Andrew Carnegie was giving away his enormous fortune to build libraries and schools for the deserving poor, almost all charitable giving was done by a very few, very rich people. Now, most of the giving is done by ordinary folks, generously wishing to better the lives of people not much different than themselves. When we return, we continue to count down the greatest achievements of the 20th century. Number 87. At the turn of the century, even fashion that was informal meant a custom-tailored three-piece suit, tie and hat for men, and 10 to 20 pounds of corsets, petticoats, and elaborate floor-length dresses for women.
They were beasts of burden to fashion.
Once the revolution in the way we dress began, we never really looked back. Clothing has become comfortable, casual, and easy to care for. We've made fashion serve us. 86. In 1904, Italian immigrant A.P. Giannini founded the Bank of Italy, later renamed Bank of America, to serve the working class. Giannini's bank pioneered such banking services as branch offices, auto loans, home mortgages, and automatic teller machines. 85. Invented in 1906 to amplify electric signals, the vacuum tube made possible all the marvels of the electronic age. 84. Synthetic fibers have made our fabrics warmer and stronger, easier to care for, and better fitting. 83.
Yeah! Debbie, will you please go make a copy of this?
Okay, Daddy.
That's my secretary.
Chester Floyd Carlson invented the photocopy machine as early as 1938. But it took 20 years before the Xerox Corporation began selling copiers commercially. For the first time, the spread of information became cheap, fast, and convenient.
Thank you, Debbie. That was fast. Which is the original?
I forget it.
82. The idea of a man going faster than the speed of sound had been around for years before the experimental Bell X-1 rocket-propelled airplane was secretly built. When test pilot Chuck Yeager volunteered for the job, no one knew whether a person or plane could survive the severe stresses of supersonic flight. On October 14, 1947, Yeager and the X-1 shot into history at more than 662 miles per hour.
Through the sound barrier.